In this series, we will be reading the lore text about the Cyberpunk 2077 setting from the book, The World of Cyberpunk 2077. This episode covers Chapter 1, The Modern World. The collapse of the old USA was one of the major world events of the 21st century. Even if the modern United States, or the new United States, as they are called today, were to reunite with the Free States, it'd still be a totally different country than it was 50 years ago. We could see signs of the collapse years before it occurred. The first three corporate wars, fought between the years 1990 and 2016, strengthened the position of the megacorporations, giving them more authority than most world governments, and the USA was no exception. Affiliations between politicians and corporations ceased to be regarded as conflicts of interest. Rather, they were treated as advantageous in the worlds of big business and politics, as the companies gained unfettered access to the world's natural resources. Environmental collapse and climate change were inevitable. Acid rain and dust storms caused by extreme deforestation soon became the America's biggest problems. Those natural disasters were accompanied by political ones. Thermonuclear war in the Middle East turned that part of the world into a radioactive wasteland, causing a global oil crisis. The US government tried to save itself by covertly manipulating European and American stock markets. But this short-sighted strategy backfired when that news was leaked to the public. Worldwide financial meltdown shook the economies of almost every country on the globe, allowing corporations to gain even more power. Meanwhile, in the USA, a coup launched by the Gang of Four, a coalition of government agencies, effectively ended federal democracy. Many states seceded, declaring themselves free states. That time also marked the emergence of nomads, a new American social class of migrants in search of water, jobs, and safety from political turmoil. Many cities and towns were deserted. Most sociologists agreed that the collapse was the worst catastrophe of the 21st century. And then came the Fourth Corporate War. The Fourth Corporate War. The Fourth Corporate War began as a race between two rival aquatech agencies. In late 2021, two oceanic exploitation corporations, CINO, Corporation Internationale Nauticale et Océanique, and OTEC, Ocean Technology and Energy Corp, vied for control over the remains of a third corpo, IHA, Internationale Handelsmarine Actiengesellschaft. The rivalry was bitter, and hostilities escalated rapidly after a brutal fiscal struggle. OTEC gained the upper hand by hiring Militech to protect their security interests. CINO responded in kind and contracted with Arasaka. Thus, the Fourth Corporate War began, otherwise known as the Ocean War. As is always the case in early stages of corporate conflict, the first attacks were carried out discreetly. Some mid-level corporate officials were assassinated, and some dirty information was stolen and revealed. Mercenary netrunners were hired by both sides, and they made dozens of attacks on data caches and stock holdings, which wrought chaos on the global economy. Those events forced Netwatch to place a temporary communication embargo on Arasaka and Militech, but the security firms were just getting warmed up. By the time Eurobank had successfully mediated a truce between CINO and OTC, the real conflict had transitioned to Militech and Arasaka. By early 2022, a new struggle between the security giants had begun, known today as the Shadow War. This marked the second stage of the fourth global corporate war. Conflict during the Shadow War phase was more overt and brutal. Mercs and edgerunners flocked to the banners of both security corporations, executing covert ops and raids on military and research facilities. Despite the visceral nature of the conflict, the deadliest battle actually occurred on the net when corporate and mercenary netrunners released a new generation of devastating viral programs upon each other. Some of this code continued to operate long after the death of its creators, leaving vast areas of the net irreparably dark and dangerous. By June of 2022, Militech and Arasaka decided that niceties and subtlety were altogether no longer necessary, and the conflict reached the third stage, called the Hot War. Fighting between the two military corporations escalated to full-scale war. Cities like Rio de Janeiro were literally reduced to rubble, their populations killed or made refugees. Global trade was paralyzed by military action and market collapse. International trade routes were hit hard, and piracy raged free and unchecked. As the flames of physical conflict burned bright, Netwatch struggled to protect the net. Weakened by the destruction of global servers and databanks, and ravaged by thousands of malicious viruses and demon-class programs, the net, as we knew it, slowly died. Finally, the countries of the world became weary of corporate conflict. Some governments openly blamed Militech and Arasaka for the situation and withdrew their support for corporations, nationalizing their weakened holdings in those countries. The Free State of Southern California seized the Los Angeles headquarters of both companies. Texas and some European countries soon followed suit. Arasaka Towers in Night City were the last of Arasaka's American headquarters to fall, wiped out by a tactical nuclear weapon detonated by a group of unidentified mercenaries. Some sources implicated the so-called Atlantis Group, including such modern legends as Rogue, Morgan Blackhand, and Johnny Silverhand. But there wasn't enough evidence to confirm the group's involvement. Morgan and Johnny were never seen again after the Arasaka Towers incident, and Rogue has repeatedly denied her participation in the operation. Under pressure from the Japanese government, Arasaka finally conceded defeat at the end of 2023. Militech emerged victorious, but was nearly as crippled as their rival. Post-war 2024 to 2035, the world took more than a decade to recover from global war, and the first few years were far from peaceful. Riot and stagnation of rebellion burned in every corner of the globe. South America was still in political turmoil, and countries in Europe and Asia attempted to revive global trade by regulating the surviving corporations in order to reestablish government control after years of corporate hegemony. In the United States, President Elizabeth Kress declared martial law in the parts of the country that remained under executive control. Arasaka was consequently held responsible for the detonation of the nuke that had destroyed the center of Night City. But rumors persisted that the Militech Corporation had funded the mysterious strike team and supplied them with the portable nuclear device. Society demanded an explanation, and President Kress exploited that sentiment to keep Militech on a short leash. Although there was no hard evidence to implicate Militech, the corporation's assets were nationalized by the U.S. government and used to strengthen federal rule. Some prominent and exonerated Militech officials were offered lucrative positions in the reformed Department of Defense. This period marked the stagnation of technological development. Corporations were struggling to survive, and the governments, both federal and local, focused on internal affairs, suppressing civil unrest and rebuilding their countries. Nomads became the lifeblood of the tech trade, scrounging through battlefields and abandoned facilities, and smuggling restricted goods in their heavily armed convoys. Despite her assurances, President Kress showed little interest in helping the devastated Night City recover. In fact, allowing the crippled city to struggle was the perfect way to bring the free state of Northern California to heel. Nevertheless, the stubborn residents of NC refused to concede, and the arduous process of rebuilding began. Meanwhile, after years of futile attempts to reclaim the old net from a rogue intelligence system and self-aware combat programs, Netwatch established the so-called Black Wall, a virtual barrier between human and controlled regions of the old net. Given the magnitude of the operation, there may be some truth to the conspiracy theories that Netwatch was forced to strike a deal with the IS in order to build Blackwall. Reunification, 2035 to 2069. The next 35 years were a slow return to normality for the nations and corporations of the world. Cities slowly began to rebuild as trade routes were reestablished. Damaged infrastructure was repaired, and technology began to regain ubiquity. In the USA, many cities that were abandoned during the collapse of 1990 to 2016 were rebuilt and repopulated with government and corporate aid. Corporations saw this as an opportunity to fix the negative public opinion they'd earned after the war, and also to reestablish influence over the culture. Abandoned by President Kress and the United States government, Night City was rebuilt by its citizens with the aid of nomads and smaller corporations. At the time, there was rampant speculation that the government had made a scapegoat of Arasaka for the nuclear detonation. and this galvanized corporations' tendencies toward sovereignty. It was the common opinion that citizens would prefer to see the return of the Asian security giant than submit themselves to federal rule. Conversely, the situation in Europe did not go as well for the old megacorporations. The established players, weakened by war, were contested by new upstarts that were backed and controlled by European national governments. In Asia, the humiliated Arasaka faced defeat with their head held high. The corporations spent a significant portion of their assets on war reparations, but a few profitable contracts allowed them to quickly regain their position as a leader in the weapon manufacturing and security industries. The setback still had lasting consequences, as Saburo Arasaka reportedly faced internal opposition, and a secret civil war began to brew within the company's ranks. New individual, isolated net networks began to emerge, mostly regional intranets. The few connections between them were carefully controlled and closely supervised by Netwatch, but their authority was significantly limited in Europe and Oceania. The new net was less available to public users and harder for netrunners to penetrate, as the most important data was sequestered. Unification War, Metal Wars, 2069 to 2070. At the end of 2069, the recently elected President Rosalind Myers presented a unification program to extend federal rule over the rogue free states under the pretense of strengthening the nation. Most of the independent American territories opposed unification. Conflict was inevitable. The federal government of the new United States, backed by nationalized Militech forces, declared war on the loosely allied separatist states. Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, Arizona, Nevada, and Northern California. Washington, Oregon, and Idaho managed to remain neutral in the conflict at the price of some concessions to the federal government. Although the free states were secretly supported by the Arasaka Corporation with weapons and security advisors, they were pressed hard by NUSA forces, who were assisted by states that supported federal intervention. This conflict, fought with the most cutting-edge military technology, became known as the Metal Wars. Night City avoided the fighting, but only barely. Northern and Southern California wound up on opposite sides of the war, with the South allying with the United States government, the North attempting to remain independent from federal rule, and the people of Night City holding their breath as they awaited invasion by federal troops. In early 2070, an NUS Army division advanced to the outskirts of the city, but invasion was prevented thanks to the quick actions of Councilman Lucius Rhine. Capitalizing on contacts made during a decade of service on the city council, Rhine besieged the long-shunned Arasaka Corporation for protection. Within days, an Arasaka supercarrier arrived in Coronado Bay. Mere hours later, the NUS Army had withdrawn. Following Arasaka's open intervention, the Treaty of Unification was finally signed by the new United States and the Free States Coalition, the Unification War. The Free States retained their autonomy, but agreed to participate in the new federal government and to cease hostilities among themselves. President Myers agreed to this solution, fearing that Arasaka's increasing involvement could result in escalating a conflict that the NUSA could not afford. The peace treaty, though unsatisfactory to all parties, was preferable to continuing the war and risking another global crisis. In the aftermath of the war, Night City was rededicated as an international free city, independent from the laws and governance of the Free State of Northern California and the new United States. Night City paid for this liberty with the further increase of megacorporate influence, as the corpos pumped money into the revitalization of the city to establish a foothold on the west coast of the NUSA. The symbolic capstone of these events took place in 2070, when Night City allowed Arasaka to build their new American headquarters downtown on the site where their previous building was destroyed in 2023. Night City prospered again, though that prosperity was not enjoyed by all. Modern threats, the stabilization of Europe and Asia at the end of the Fourth Corporate War, and the Unification War didn't suddenly turn the world into a happy place, full of unicorns and glitter. Although the technological recession between the 2020s and the 2040s lowered global pollution levels, humanity still faces some serious threats. By now, climate change is the greatest and the most unpredictable. Hurricanes and tornadoes of enormous scale and intensity have decimated populations around the world. Haiti was officially abandoned in 2062 after a series of vicious storms ravaged the island nation. Hundreds of thousands of Haitians died during the event, and the exodus it caused, and the devastation of the Caribbean islands was later deemed to be one of the worst natural disasters of the late 21st century. Desertification and drought are even more dangerous, threatening the entire population of South America, as well as regions in North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Clear water is becoming scarce, and the situation hasn't improved in the last few years. On the other hand, flooding is also frequent. In the last 10 years, floods have destroyed parts of LA and Night City. The Netherlands lost 1/3 of their territory, but thanks to the newest dam building technology, they avoided completely submerging into the North Sea. The Maldives were not so fortunate. The archipelago sank entirely about 20 years ago. These grim circumstances led to significant soil depletion, causing famine that took hundreds of thousands of lives in Asia and Africa. It was only by introducing hydroponic cultivation and vertical city farms that some urban regions avoided total extinction. Development of cyber technologies introduced the problem of cyberpsychosis. Sufferers emotionally isolate themselves from other people until human interaction eventually becomes emotionally aggravating. That aggravation grows into contempt and eventually violence. although this mental illness has been recognized for half a century, and many studies suggest that it's connected to the quantity of an individual's cyber augmentations. We still aren't sure what causes some individuals to be more susceptible to the illness than others. Nevertheless, cyberpsychosis remains a major health concern in our technologically dependent world. To cap this list of woes, we have a dangerous degree of social stratification, an enormous crime rate, and migratory unrest in almost every part of the world. But most of you are probably already aware of that. You face it every day. Things are far from being okay, and if we want to survive as a species, we need to seriously reevaluate our value system. The question is it too late for that? Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this audio journey into the world of Cyberpunk 2077. In our next episode, we will cover the technology of tomorrow.